Welcome to the webinar, How Hackers Go From Zero to Takeover, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Sarah Edwards, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenters for today is Sherry Davidoff and Tom Pohl. Sherry is the CEO of LMG Security and the author of the 3 books, including Data Breaches, Crisis and Opportunity. She's a certified penetration tester and a forensic analyst and a graduate of MIT. Sherry has been called a security badass by the New York Times. Sherry is the co-author of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortions. Tom Pohl is the penetration testing team manager at LMG Security. Tom is a seasoned hacker and a winner of many hacking competitions, including DEF CON, Wild West Hacking, Best ThoughtCon, and more. Sherry, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks, Tom, for joining me on today's webinar. Really excited to see how you hack Me Inc. today. We're going to start off by talking about a trend that Tom is going to take advantage of, software exploits. If it seems like there are more and more software exploits coming out, that's because there kind of are. So we're going to talk about that. Then Tom is going to tell us about a new vulnerability in F5 devices, and he will show us how he goes from zero to full takeover of Me Inc. In our laboratory. And we're not going to leave you hanging. We're going to end by talking about 10 tips to stop hackers and how our hacker could be blocked at each stage. And with that, it seems like every day another zero-day exploit comes out. And the big one that is wreaking havoc around the world are the recent Cisco zero-day exploits. Cisco, of course, makes network appliances. Right now, there's been a zero-day exploit that Cisco announced on October 16th. And the number of devices that are vulnerable to this attack, which you can see in Shodan, was over 150,000. You can actually just scan the internet for these devices, and the hackers are doing that. And then you can also tell which ones have actually been hacked, because the hackers are executing the same exploit over and over and over again. So we know that it hit over 40,000 recently, and we'll dig into that more in a few minutes. So let's walk through this attack. On October 16th, Cisco announced a critical vulnerability which enables hackers to exploit the device, gain administrative level privileges, level 15 for those of you that are technical folks, and they could actually issue level 15 commands unauthenticated from the internet. Now, this only works in situations where that admin interface is exposed to the world. So a very simple way to mitigate this is to remove that login page from the big bad internet. So that's a very simple fix. Once hackers were able to gain that level of access, they could create a local user account and use that to just log into the device through this exposed web interface. Now, it turned out that that wasn't all. 4 days later, Cisco announced a second vulnerability. As they were investigating, they found out that hackers were able to escalate their privileges. They could actually escape the iOS and actually access the underlying Linux operating system, and that allowed them to maintain persistence. They could execute arbitrary commands on the operating system and therefore install a persistent backdoor. So boom, right there, this exploit is super critical, lets them right in. Now, again, I mentioned we could see how many devices have been hacked. You can actually scan and figure that out. And there have been a number of news stories about it. The attackers apparently read the news, and they were aware that defenders were onto them. So they actually updated their attack to make it more stealthy. And when they did that, all of a sudden the number of hacked devices dropped to 0, not because they actually dropped to 0, but because defenders weren't able to detect that anymore. So then it's always a cat and mouse game. Defenders updated their indicators of compromise, and boom, we saw we could suddenly detect the number of hacked devices again. But you can see that the criminals are adapting and defenders have to adapt in response. So what does this mean for us? Again, we have seen many, many vulnerabilities over the past few years. I mean, vulnerabilities have always been a problem, but hackers are getting better and better about exploiting them and taking advantage of them. So Cisco is only the most recent. Earlier this year, we had MOVEit. There are now 71 million users whose information has been exposed, and over 2,300 organizations that have announced a data breach because of the MOVEit vulnerabilities. Microsoft Exchange also caused problems around the world. Log4j, the vulnerability that set the internet on fire, according to headlines. We'll touch on that today, and many others. One of the reasons we're seeing so many software exploits is because they're getting easy to buy on the dark web. So as we've talked about before, this is an example of a site on the dark web where exploits are bought and sold. It's called 0 Day Today. And many of the exploits up there are now available completely free. For those that aren't, you can usually go in, browse, see the ones you want, and then purchase them for Bitcoin on the dark web. We're likely to see more and more 0 day exploits. So be prepared for these, guys. It's part of it is because we've had so many source code breaches over the years. And just speaking from my own experience, the vast majority of tech company hacks that I've seen have never been reported because they don't involve PII. They don't involve materials that have been stolen, which require public notification. So it's likely that there have been many more thefts of source code than we even know about at this point. And that really increases the systemic risk for all of us because once hackers have access to source code, they can comb through them, they can find bugs much more quickly. We also know that hackers are targeting researchers. We've seen campaigns on that. We've seen them looking for vulnerabilities. Microsoft, we found out that in 2017, that 4 years earlier, their bug tracking database had been hacked. Why do criminals want to know about all these bugs? Well, because then they can write exploits to match. So with that, let's see how hackers take advantage of this on a day-to-day basis. Evil Tom here, our head of penetration testing, is going to walk you through this exploit. And Tom, I know that this isn't just in theory. You were actually working on a penetration test last week where you broke into a company with this brand new vulnerability, correct?
That's correct. We were on a client network that was actually really well secured. And I had heard about this new vulnerability via news sources, and I decided to see if I could recreate and see if they were vulnerable to it. And sure enough, I was able to exploit this vulnerability about 5 days. It was only about 5 days after the patch was announced.
Great. Well, we're going to watch this in action. So here's Evil Tom, who breaks into organizations. He's going to put his evil hat on for us today. And Tom is going to attack Hackme Inc. We picked on Hackme before. Hackme is a widget manufacturer. They're a mid-sized business, and they do lots of e-commerce to sell their widgets. So they also have sensitive information like payment card numbers, customer data, and of course, 24/7 uptime requirements, not just for their manufacturing, but also for sales purposes. So there's two people within Hackme Inc. that you should know today. One is Owen Abel, the CFO, and the other one is Justin Time, our IT administrator. So two important folks at Hackme Inc. that Tom will be picking on. All right, Tom, tell us about this new vulnerability that was just announced.
Okay, well, so a lot of organizations run a product from F5 called Big IP. And in this particular case, Big IP is often used as like a network load balancer in front of web servers. So in this, I think in this particular case, Hackme Inc. was running a load balancer in front of all their web servers to handle the crushing load of people buying widgets off the internet. But they made a mistake, and they put the management interface of the F5 device on the internet. And that's where there's a new vulnerability, CVE 2023-46747, comes into play, where if that's exposed someplace where an attacker can reach it, they can take over the device as well as use that device to pivot into other parts of the organization. And that's what we're going to do.
So you're looking to target Hackme Inc. And
Yep.
It sounds like the first thing, or maybe you weren't looking to target Hackme Inc. A lot of hackers are just scanning the internet and they find this. Can you explain what this is?
Yep, so this is the login interface to the F5 Big IP management interface. So this is the thing that you don't want to find on the internet. But I always say whenever there's something that can be on the internet, there's lots of them that you will find are on the internet. In fact, I think is that the next slide that shows the about 40,000 of these devices a week ago were on the internet. It's down to 24,000 now as people are pulling this management interface off the internet as they're being exploited. This is actually a pretty big problem.
Tom, if someone has one of these devices on the internet today, what do you think? And this was just announced, what, like October 26th, something like that?
Yeah.
So we're looking at less than 2 weeks or 2 weeks. What is the likelihood that they've already been exploited when they take these off the internet?
Significant. I mean, I would at this point assume that if you still have a management interface on an unpatched device on the internet, it's probably hacked.
Right. So this is why vulnerabilities today are incidents if they're internet facing. So I know you were looking for an exploit for this, weren't you?
Yeah, so often whenever I hear about an exploit, my first move is to go to Google and I put in the CVE number, and then I'm looking for what's called a proof of concept, and often they're on GitHub or other places. And the first thing that popped up, it was kind of crafty of this person, but they put a mass exploitable script that you could pay for. They were advertising it on GitHub as something that they could go scan the internet for. They had 4 limited copies for sale, but luckily, I think GitHub or the author ended up removing it off of the internet pretty quickly. But I did go ahead and I found a partial working script that someone was writing in order to take advantage of this exploit. It didn't work. It was kind of broken. So I was able to kind of use that as a starting point and fix it, and basically perform this attack for myself against our client's network.
So can you tell us a little bit about this new bug?
So this bug is kind of cool. It's called an HTTP smuggling attack. But in this particular case, they're sending what are called AJP messages directly to the underlying application server container in order to perform an action on this device. And the action in this particular case was to create an administrator account. There was some really tight constraints around how big this payload could be, and the researchers at Praetorian did a really fantastic job at figuring exactly what they could and couldn't do in order to take advantage of this vulnerability. So in this particular case, I used some of their code to create an administrator account on the device.
Yeah, and I know you also like to use the penetration testing tool Burp Suite. And so this is Tom manipulating a web request. So he's sending a request to this web interface and he's changing it and smashing another HTTP message onto it. And you can see here embedded in this, he's created a new username and a new password, and that has administrator level access. Exactly. Very evil of you, evil Tom. So then you're able to log in, and then what happens?
Well, so when you create an account on an F5, you can't use that account right away. So the first thing you have to do is you have to change the password. So you log in with that kind of a temporary password, and they force you to create a new password. And then once you create that new password, then you can go get what's called a token. And then once you have that token, then you can do some really fun stuff. Basically, first of all, a token is kind of like a hall pass. It represents a small piece of data that you present to the F5, and it says, "Ooh, I know who you are, and I trust you." And so instead of using a username and password over and over again, you can use a token in order to provide that authentication mechanism.
And if you want more details, check out our September webinar, which was on cloud and web app hacking, where we go into more detail about this. So then, Evil Tom, you logged in. You got your token.
Yep, got my token. Yeah, so I presented that new username and password after I changed it, and then I got my token. And then with that token, there's other API endpoints that F5 legitimately makes available. So in this case, it's called management tmutil bash. So you can actually run what are called bash commands or underlying Linux commands against the F5 remotely because they have this auth token. And with that auth token, I go ahead and I created a reverse shell. So it's basically backdoor access, from the underlying operating system, gives me a shell directly into the operating system remotely outside of the organization.
So for those of you who may not be as technical, basically Tom uses the web interface to run commands, and he can send them directly from the internet and access the underlying operating system of that's probably still a little technical, but you guys are good. And then he can run commands on this device. He's created a new user to do this. So nice work, Evil Tom. So what can you do to protect against this? First of all, you want to scan that internet-facing perimeter regularly. Obviously, we want to know if there's any vulnerabilities. Sometimes that's the first step. Sometimes you have old vulnerabilities in systems that are internet facing, and folks just aren't detecting those or responding to them. So step one, do vulnerability scanning. But often, again, these are very new, and they may not even show up in vulnerability scans, which is why we say to minimize your attack surface. This wouldn't have happened if the web interface wasn't out there to begin with. And usually your admins don't need to log in from random places all over the world. You know exactly where they're coming from, and so you can limit access to that specific spot. Or maybe they're coming through a VPN, so you don't even have to worry about it. This issue did not show up with a vulnerability scanner, and this is not just the case last week. It didn't show up on Tom's pen test last week. You just have a good spidey sense, Tom. It also did not show up last night. We did another check. So here it's been almost 2 weeks. We're doing a vulnerability scan, and as you can see, something is missing here. There are no critical vulnerabilities. Like, oh yeah, no problem. The vulnerability scanner is saying the highest risk issue is a medium level issue in SSL and TLS. So we know that it missed stuff. And unfortunately, that's normal. That's not uncommon. And this is why you want to conduct penetration testing. So great job, Tom, last week, because humans can find things that, frankly, vulnerability scanners don't. And often those are things like bypass issues or just taking advantage of brand new vulnerabilities that you can read about in the news, but maybe are not yet in a vulnerability scanner. Microsoft released a report last year that showed the average time between the day a patch is released and the day it's available in scanning tools is 120 days, 4 months. So imagine these devices are sitting out there for 4 months, and as Tom was saying earlier, they are almost certainly hacked within a couple weeks, because just as we can scan the internet and look for them, so can the attackers. By 2 weeks, you're likely to see exploitation in the wild, significant exploitation in the wild. So how can we make sure we know about this and protect against this? Tom, how did you find out about it, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, so there's a lot of places that you should be monitoring. So any software that you're running, especially internet-facing software, you need to be constantly monitoring for vulnerability announcements. I actually learned about this through a news article I was reading over the weekend. And I think when the penetration test resumed on Monday morning, I'm like, oh, I found this device I just read about. I bet it's not been patched yet. But yeah, there's all sorts of different ways that you should be monitoring, through social media. There's other commercial platforms you can subscribe to, security vendors that are paying attention to this and alerting you through feeds, as well as through government programs like CISA. They're not necessarily as quick, but they're getting better over the years in alerting users quickly to vulnerabilities that are exploitable.
Yeah, so make sure you're setting up your intel sources. Another issue is it can be really hard to determine if you're affected. This one was easy. Tom and I actually looked through this and we're like, oh yeah, all versions of this device are affected. But what you see on the screen here is SolarWinds. SolarWinds actually made a color-coded chart so you could tell exactly what versions were affected and what weren't. And then because multiple vulnerabilities were disclosed, they had to make additional columns so you could tell, okay, which vulnerability affected which product. And this is not unusual. We often see this. So you have to figure out, am I running affected software? Am I running an affected version of it? And then go from there. Another good example is Log4j. If you remember Log4j, it's a vulnerability in an error logging service that has been embedded into products around the world. It's open source, and so many vendors have embedded this in their products, which are in turn used by other organizations. So this was really devastating when it came out a couple of years ago in December of 2021. It allowed for remote code execution as well, so hackers could break in and execute commands. Tom, I know you have used this a ton on penetration tests, correct?
It's a gift that keeps on giving.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, I mean, when's the most recent time you saw a vulnerable Log4j system? This came out in 2021.
3 weeks ago.
So, and I'm just curious, like, do you know the cause of that? Was it just something was missed in patching, or?
Yeah, either missing patches. A lot of times, Log4j is embedded in other people's products, and sometimes those products are hard to patch. And so, or sometimes they're hard to know that it's part of a product. So unless you're paying attention to those vendor releases that alert you to these things, you may not realize that this is a component that was used in a product that you're using in your network.
right? And by the time you find out, it's probably already hacked, with Log4j in particular. So this was an example where it was weaponized as an exploit and then disclosed the next day. Now remember, as soon as the vendor announces a vulnerability, people are going to try to exploit it. I mean, that's just a fact. It's happening right away. But in some cases, you may not find out about it until after the exploits start to happen. So I just want to stress to everybody on the call, we have to plan for a quick response, because all the evil Toms out there are going to be hacking as soon as the vendor announces, if not before. So these days we see 0-day vulnerabilities often, not just 0 days, but vulnerabilities in general, included in incident response plans. And CISA actually has playbooks that are for incident and vulnerability response. So check these out if you haven't already. Feel free to drop me a line on LinkedIn, as always, if you want a link to that material, and I'd be happy to shoot it over to you. But if you just Google, you'll find it. So we need to figure out, CISA's playbook is a great illustration. Is a vulnerability present? Yes or no? That's not always simple, but let's say we find out yes. You do need to look for signs of exploitation, and that'll go through your incident response program. But then the question becomes, can we patch? And in this case, the answer was yes, because it was not a 0-day. The vendor did have a patch. So Tom, do you want to speak with that?
Yeah, so what's interesting in particular is that in some of these products, it can be challenging to patch. Whereas you may not be ready, or you may have it completely integrated into a larger web application that if you upgrade, it might break things. And so in this particular case, F5 recognizes that. So they didn't just issue a patch, they also issued a mitigation script. So you could run the script that would modify the underlying configuration in order to prevent this exploit from occurring, besides just taking a patch as a solution to the problem. But there's sometimes risks to that, right? It was interesting, even in the mitigation script that they released, they said, hey, sometimes your web server may fail to restart. And so even doing the mitigation can be risky sometimes. And so, you know, having a plan, a rollback plan, and other strategies in order to handle vulnerabilities and mitigations is important.
It's no wonder people delay, because obviously there's a lot of potential impact. And then I know on your recent pen test, some of the systems were patched, right?
Yeah, so that was the other interesting thing, is that in this client network, they actually had multiple sets of these devices, and they weren't all patched. And so some were, and some were not. And I was able to exploit it. It happened to be that I found and exploited on the first boxes I came across weren't patched. And then when I went and took this exploit across the larger portion of their network, I discovered some of them it didn't work on. And that's when I spoke with the client about this issue right away, they're like, oh gosh, we applied that fix. And at first I thought that I had found some kind of a way around the mitigation, but it turned out they hadn't actually implemented the mitigation strategy across their entire organization.
Yeah, and often like a dev environment gets missed, or some servers that were not in the primary production environment just don't get patched quickly for whatever reason. It's an organizational issue. You know, some of these are not technical security issues, but really process issues. So, okay, let's get back to our webinar and to Evil Tom hacking Hack Me Inc. So you're not going to stop here, I know you. But once you've got a foothold in the environment, Evil Tom wants full network takeover, and ideally cloud takeover, which we're going to see here. That's very exciting. So tell us what you're going to do.
All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to, now that we've got low-level access into the device, we're going to find password hashes, right? You know, it's a Linux-based device, so we're going to go find password hashes, and then we're going to take a step further, see if there's any clear text credentials we can get, and then beyond that, I'm going to show you how you can recover keys, and keys are key to maintaining access to a device once you've compromised it in this particular case. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dump passwords, right? And so when I get into the system and Linux-based platforms, Etsy Shadow is a file on the system that will have password hashes. And what these are good for is it's basically a hash is a representation of your password, right? It's a one-way cryptographic function in order to secure your password. and we're going to go grab those and start trying to crack those passwords.
Yeah, so for those of you, if any of you have ever wondered what password cracking means, let's go through that. What you're looking at is a picture of LMG's very first cracking computer. And what it does is it goes through as quickly as possible and it guesses all the possible passwords that it can think of. Remember, password hashes cannot be reversed, but what you can do is use that cryptographic algorithm to hash every possible combination and see if it matches. So we're going to hash banana and see if it matches the password that we've stored. Nope. How about banana 2023? How about banana 2024? And we're going to go through the list until we say, whoa, we just found a match. And the more guesses you have, the more likely you are to find a password. So this is why it's important to pick long passwords, because it's harder to guess all possible combinations if it's really long. But our cracking rigs here at LMG can guess billions of passwords per second. So as soon as Tom and his team get password hashes on a pen test, very quickly they go into the password cracking rig. And here it is in action.
This is it's called a SHA-56 Unix hash. And so we found 7 of them on this device. But SHA-512 crypt hashes are actually a little bit slow to crack. If you can see here, it says with these rules that we're running, it's going to take 43 days in order to make it through our entire rule set. And so that's good for F5. So, meanwhile, while we're waiting the 43 days for these passwords,
and hackers will wait. They're going to be like, okay, we'll work on something else and come back.
It may not take 43 days. If you've got a weak password or something I can guess easy, I might be able to get one of these 7 passwords in a day instead of 43 days. And so it's all a matter of how long and strong your passwords are.
So Tom, I know that you go through this in your class, which is running next week. Yeah, tell us about your class.
Yeah, so yeah, if you want practice doing some of these things, we actually have a virtual class for pen testing for IT professionals, where we teach you as IT professionals how to attack yourselves first, how to look at your organization critically and be able to do things like, crack passwords or break into your systems or look at things in the way that an attacker would, so you can secure yourselves before the attackers get into your organization.
So if you know an IT person or you are an IT person, feel free to join that class. I believe the regular registration deadline is tomorrow, so sign up if you're interested. Okay, so you dumped password hashes. You're waiting to see if some passwords will crack. What are you going to do in the meantime?
Yep. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for passwords to crack, we're going to go look around. And so as I've started to learn a little bit more about how F5 devices work, I discovered that when you domain join an F5 into your network, you have to give it some credentials. So I went and I discovered the location where your credentials are stored. So literally in a configuration file on the F5, they store your clear text credentials to a domain admin account in a configuration file on the device that we can just go read the file and get the username and password, which will give us more access.
Too easy. Unfortunately, this is really common, right? How often do you see this?
All the time, and a lot of times they, devices make it so you don't need a privilege level account. I think in this particular case, F5 actually wants you to have a higher level administrative account. I don't know that it needs to be domain admin, but it's easy. Typically, the easy button is let's just make it a domain admin account. Then we know it's going to have the access it needs in order to be able to do what it needs to on the network. And so in this particular case, that's what's happened is they've given this device a domain administrator credential, and then we can use that to land and expand and take over the entire organization. So we actually now are pivoting through this device, and then we discovered that we could talk to other things on the inside of their network by hitting the F5 device and going through that device to get to other devices. And the first thing that we hit up was the domain controller, and we could get remote desktop access directly to the domain controller using this account by pivoting through the F5 Big IP appliance.
So this should not, this is a service account. There's no human that should be using this to remotely log into another computer. So just restricting that kind of access would be key. But here you can see it worked. Tom, you were able to log in, evil Tom, and gain full access to the domain controller.
Yep. And so once we're on the domain controller, then we can really go wherever we want to go, right? We'll show you here in a minute how we're going to start scanning across the entire internal organization. And that's kind of where, we get to with this next slide is often you don't want your network to be like an M&M, right? Where it's hard on the inside and soft and squishy on the inside. Where you need to segment your network, right? Like from an edge device like a big IP, I shouldn't be able to pivot and then RDP into your domain controller. So, the level of access that the F5 needs should be limited to exactly the services that it needs to be able to talk to on the inside and no more.
So in general, we want to be using principle of least privilege also. You were able to log in as domain access, you hacked an F5, you grabbed an account off of that, you were able to log in as domain administrator. Wow. We need to be using the principle of least privilege where we're just minimizing the access. This didn't really need to be domain admin. You should make sure you're using, that you go through. It's not like the fanciest and coolest security techniques. It really is just crossing the T's and dotting the I's and making sure you've defined your roles and that you regularly audit your accounts. And that boring stuff will save your bacon, you guys, when a hacker does manage to get onto your F5. Because really, we're at the point where you have to assume you're vulnerable. You have to assume your perimeter devices are vulnerable. Someone's going to get access to them. So start there, look at the kind of access your perimeter devices have, and make sure when, not if, one of those gets hacked, that hackers can't actually do anything with that access. Then what did you do?
So then we start, we use that jumping off point on your domain controller to go look around, like, what do we have access to? If we're truly evil and we're going to ultimately extort your organization and ransomware it, we first need to go see what crown jewels do you have. So we're going to go find all the sensitive information. And so we use a tool called Advanced IP Scanner, and that we went and looked at the entire inside of Hack Me Inc.'s network at this point. Because we're on the domain controller pretty much has to talk to everything. And so we use that to go find sensitive documents and information that then we could, as a bad guy, we could extract from your network and before launching a ransomware attack.
So this is a common trend that we're seeing, by the way. If you look at that previous slide, Tom is using normal IT tools like Advanced IP Scanner to scan the network, and we've used RDP to break into the domain controller. These are normal, legitimate IT tools, and they're not going to trip antivirus. They're not going to raise alarm bells. So we really need to be thinking about how do we detect abnormal activity, even if the hackers are using legitimate tools. This is a trend. So Tom, I know the other thing you do is you disable security software when you need to. You've told me about some pen tests recently where the EDR didn't stop you or things like that, but can you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, so we don't want to be detected, right? So as an evil attacker, we want to make sure that we have all the ability to stay in your network as long as possible. So one thing that guys will do is they will turn off your antivirus. They'll turn off your endpoint detection and response if they can. And so that's what we did in this particular case. Is we went ahead and turned off Windows Defender was the antivirus in this particular case, and we pushed it out as a policy across the entire organization. So with a couple clicks, now nobody's got antivirus on their desktop, and we can stay in your network a little bit longer undetected.
Wow. So, and then another trend we're seeing is locking out administrators and changing passwords. This is evil.
That's
I know
right.
You don't actually do this part on pen tests, but we're seeing it in hacks where why not? You locked out just in time so that he can't stop you, right?
That's right. It's harder to stop us if you can't log in by yourself.
Okay, so then what'd you do on the domain controller?
Yeah, so then we also we used one of our tools to pivot a tool called Crack Map Exec to the domain controller, and then what we did was we dumped all the password hashes for all the users in the entire organization so that we could try to crack those passwords as well. Those are actually NTLM passwords, which are much easier to crack than SHA-512. So these I can crack way faster. And once I crack these, then it'll give us more access to say, once Justin's onto us and so, oh no, I need to start changing passwords. There's probably going to be some users that don't maybe change the password. And so if we can crack those, we can potentially use those to maintain persistent access into your organization. So we're going to dump all the passwords so that, maybe somebody's not going to change theirs.
In terms of defense, a really smart approach is to use multi-factor authentication, at least for admins internal to the organization. So that way, when Tom finds that another domain admin account, or he takes over just-in-time's account, or whatever it is, he can't move throughout the network as an admin unless he has that second form of authentication. So these days, best practice is to not just to deploy MFA externally for all external remote access, and also to deploy internally for your administrative accounts. Those are high-risk accounts.
So, the way that works in practice is that when we would have gone to log into your domain controller via RDP, it would have popped up before it actually logged us in to say, hey, now go approve this login using your multi-factor authentication. And we wouldn't have had that, so then we wouldn't have been able to RDP in the domain controller.
Right. How often do you see this actually deployed when you're doing pen tests?
Not often enough. Right, I've seen it in most recently in a couple of different organizations, but generally this is not yet a well-adopted practice that we've seen.
Okay, so often, all too often these days, we see the hackers in their next phase deploying ransomware. But before they do that, they have to prep the environment, which means they're going to make a little noise, and that is our opportunity to detect them. So what are we seeing here?
So here we're basically kind of looking through the entire organization and looking at where the data is at so that we can go gain access or make sure that we've got access to all the things. So when we deploy our ransomware, it's going to be effective in encrypting all of your files, not just a few of them. So we want to make sure that before we go and detonate this, we're going to have complete access to all your data in the environment.
Yeah, so we often see permission changes, configuration changes, just to make sure that ransomware is going to be as maximally effective as possible. And this is where deploying advanced detection strategies can really make a difference. So number one, you want to have a really good EDR. It's not just enough to have antivirus anymore. Make sure you have endpoint detection and response software or equivalent so that you're detecting strange and abnormal behaviors and that responders can go in and quarantine properly, things like that. Also, network detection and response software can be useful. Port scan detection, we often see hackers doing port scanning. That can really light up your network like a Christmas tree so you can see what the attacker is doing. And then often after the fact, when we've seen a big incident, there have been alerts, but no one has been responding to them. It happens most often on the weekends or on holidays. Remember, hackers act quickly. We saw that in our webinar last month with scams and fraud. Often they're from zero to takeover within just a few hours. Tom, how long did it take you, or how long would it take you when you, from the time you break in externally to the time you can get full domain admin access?
Within half an hour, typically. And that's only because it's not scripted. Yeah, if I was targeting lots of organizations in a major breach, kind of like a move it, I would have automated as much as possible so you can just hit the maximum amount of organizations in a short period of time. In these particular cases, I'm moving more methodically and I'm trying to take a little bit more time. So half hour, 45 minutes probably.
Okay, so in the meantime, Just in Time is probably pulling his hair out right now and saying, somebody's locked me out, I need to get back in. And once the defenders are onto you, they're gonna wanna try to lock you out. We often see that with changing of passwords. However, I know we've seen on recent pen tests that even when your password has been changed, that hasn't fully locked you out. Why is that?
Yeah, so anymore, there's multiple ways in gaining access to accounts, right? And in this particular case, there's a secret key that's stored on the device that allows root level access directly to the device if you have a copy of that key. And so since we had, low level access to the device, we can go copy that key off so that we can log back into that device later. Other examples on your network, say you've got a certificate authority on your network that can issue a certificate for a user account. If you issue a certificate and somebody changes that user's password, that certificate is typically still good for a year. So, so there's multiple access points into an account. This is in this F5 case, there's an automatically generated private key that's authorized to the device. All you have to do is go and grab it, and then you can have persistent access into that device.
For those of you that may not directly work with key-based authentication, a key is just a long string of bits. Like it's just data, ones and zeros and letters and numbers. And it's typically stored in a file on your computer or a device that you can attach. So for those of you that are wondering, you're seeing a key on the screen here. And Tom, you went spelunking for secret keys and you found them on this device, correct?
I did. So I went into the root user's SSH directory, and I discovered that it had a public identity of a key authorized in the authorized keys file. And so I'm like, well, if it's authorized, where is that key? And sure enough, in that same directory, it was an identity file that stored that secret key. And so then I used that secret key to log in back into that device. So I didn't even need to know that root user's password. All I needed to say, hey, I'm here and I can prove I've got this key. And it's just like, yep, you're in. So it's my golden ticket back into the environment. So even if they had changed the credentials, it doesn't matter unless they also change that private key, which they're not likely to do.
So now you're pivoting through the F5. You've gotten access to this whole environment through the front door, through the F5. You've gone into the domain controller, and now what are you doing?
Yeah, so now it's a matter of land and expand, right? So I'm going to go copy all your data off. I don't do this on a penetration test, right? I prove what we could do, but in the evil bad guy world, right? If I was an evil bad guy, I would go, and at this point, I'd copy all your data off because I'm going to ransom you and then sell you back access to your data. If you don't want to buy your data access back, I could go sell it to somebody else. And so that's what the attackers are doing. Is they're at this point they're copying off all of your data across your organization.
Yeah, and as we've talked about before, data exposure is a trend. In the vast majority of extortion cases, we are seeing data exfiltration, and that stolen data is what's used as leverage in a lot of cases, especially if you have good backups. It's the data that's the real problem. So from there, we can spread to the cloud, and this is honestly a big problem because I know, Tom, you've talked about doing this with printer accounts, and we see here that this same service account that you stole from the F5 also has access to log into Office 365 as an administrator account. And that's really common because of the way that this is set up.
This is a hybrid environment with Azure. And so basically the user accounts that work on premise also work in the cloud. And so since this was a domain administrator account, we may not have access to Office 365 applications, but we absolutely have access to the Office 365 management interface. And if you have access to the management interface, you can be extra evil.
So then what we're going to do from here is modify, in this case, we're choosing to start modifying multi-factor authentication settings so we can break into other accounts. And this is very common. We see this with things, well, heck, the recent MGM case, they're targeting multi-factor authentication. The hackers want to disable it for other user accounts that they want to target. So often when hackers get that admin access, they're going to go through and disable things. And again, you're not going to see your penetration testers doing it, but this is something that your hackers are going to do.
In this particular case, we added another authentication mechanism. So we added our own evil bad guy phone number. So then when we go log in as OEnable, we can say, oh, don't use the regular authentication mechanism that Owen uses, use ours instead.
And the only reason this was possible was because phone authentication was enabled as a fallback mechanism. So normally at Hack Me Inc., employees use an authenticator app, which is very secure. However, if you can't get in with the app, it allows you to get a phone call or a text message. And so the hacker was able to add a fallback mechanism and just get a text or a phone call to their own phone. So this is the kind of thing that can be caught, by the way, in a cloud configuration review. So the best approach is to, with cloud environments, is to make sure you're reviewing it, you're turning off things like weak fallback options, and these little configuration changes can make a huge difference. Also turning on things like web-based access to the admin environment or access to webmail for service accounts, as we saw in your printer talk, Tom, that can make a big difference too. So then you set up universal email forwarding. And this was an issue as well, because when it's set up through Exchange by an administrator, the users don't see this, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So what happens is, often when an attacker may access a single user's mailbox, they'll set up forwarding rules, and you can detect that by the user can go in and look at these forwarding rules. But since I'm a domain administrator and I can get into the management interface of M365, I can create forwarding rules so, that you can't see as a user. So you'll have no idea that all your emails that you're receiving are getting forwarded to me as the bad guy.
So then we also are able to explore the whole environment. Once you reset Owen's, the CFO's multi-factor authentication, the attacker can break in, they can explore SharePoint, they can explore email, really anything that account has access to. And you could do this for any user in the environment, correct?
That's right. And so in this particular case, we're into Owen's mailbox, and we can explore just his mailbox. We can explore everything that he's got access to. And then we can take it one step further, and we can actually do what's called e-discovery search. And so we can, in this case, I think we just targeted Owen's mailbox, but we can make a keyword search where we can search through everyone in the organization's mailbox for things, for search terms like invoice or payment, transfer, wire transfer, bank, things of that nature. In this case, we found 10 items in Owen's mailbox that match the description. So then you can actually download those emails directly from the e-discovery search tool as a domain administrator.
Yeah, and you could also search across the entire environment as well. So this was just a small sampling of what an attacker could do with this level of access. So that's our zero to takeover. Evil Tom, thank you so much. You started off by exploiting a vulnerable device. That was so cool. And for those of you that have either F5 or Cisco devices in your environment, run, don't walk, check and make sure they're patched. If you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to our penetration testing team or to Tom, and he can provide advice. You want to steal hashes and passwords and secrets. Well, you don't want to. I'm sorry, the attacker will steal hashes and passwords and secrets. Pivot to the rest of your network, steal your data to be used often for extortion or just resale. Move to taking over the cloud environment and not just full network takeover, but really full environment takeover. Anything you want to add, Evil Tom? This was very evil.
These management interfaces should absolutely be protected at all costs. Even in the case of the organization that I was testing, their management interface wasn't on the internet, but it was available to anyone on the inside of your organization. So even though you think you may be protected because these interfaces aren't on the public internet, even locking them down as to who can reach these interfaces even on the inside of your network is super important.
So 10 tips to defend yourself. Happy to provide copies of this slide, by the way, of all the slides. Feel free to let us know if you'd like a copy. Attack surface monitoring. Don't just look for vulnerabilities, look for any administrative interfaces, to Tom's point, and just get them off the internet if you don't need them. Conduct penetration testing so that you can detect things that automated tools do not and really get to the root of these issues. Monitor threat intelligence so that you know you're going to hear about vendor issues as quickly as possible. Update your response procedures. Make sure you're including vulnerabilities, and especially zero-day vulnerabilities in your incident response. Even things that aren't 0 days. If you have an unpatched system up for 3 days or 5 days after an exploit has been released, maybe game over already by the time you get it patched. Make sure you have an accurate data and asset inventory so you know everything that needs to be patched is. Segment your network so that when, not if, an attacker makes it into something, they can't get access to everything. Same thing, implement the principle of least privilege. You don't need every service account to be a domain administrator. Deploy detection strategies so that you can catch the evil Toms in your network and root them out. Use multi-factor authentication, especially for administrators within your network. So it's not just for external use, also can prevent hackers from moving around inside your network. And then conduct cloud configuration reviews to really minimize the risk to your cloud environment. And then Tom, we're really excited about your class. I know tomorrow's the registration deadline. Anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this particular new vulnerability because it wasn't
supposed to say that.
It was fun. It was a good exercise. I don't get often to craft a working proof of concept very often. So a lot of times they're already available, and so in this particular case, it was good to be able to cut my teeth a little bit in creating a working proof of concept from something that was broken.
Tom, anything, do you get any questions when you're doing pen tests?
All the time. Yeah, no, I love, I live and breathe this stuff. This is so much fun that, I always love educating our customers in how to not only recreate, but then fix these problems. That's what I really live for is making sure that, our clients can understand their risks and vulnerabilities and then fix them.
Thank you, Sherry and Tom. We actually do have a question. Do you have recommendations for vulnerability scanning software that updates faster than 4 months?
It depends. So, we recommend Tenable here. I mean, Tenable still isn't detecting it even as of yesterday. But like when Log4j came out, they were on top of it. So I think it depends a lot of times on the criticality and the ease of detection in terms of how long it takes between an exploit being widely available and when a vulnerability scanning product can safely detect it. I think that's often the issue is hard to scan for this without actually exploiting it in a way that might be dangerous.
Yeah, and Tenable is what LMG uses for our clients. We do manage scanning as well. And it's definitely, I mean, I think it's an industry leader. And it's definitely one that we recommend. They've been around a long time and they're very responsive. No vulnerability scanner is going to pick up on everything. And I was interested, Tom, because we talked about the fact that this wasn't yet in the vulnerability scanning tool. And I thought it was interesting when you talked about the subtleties and how hard it can be to detect whether a product truly is vulnerable. Can you speak to that and like the risk of false positives?
Yeah, so in many cases, if you ask a product, what version are you? It's not going to be like, I'm this exactly, some products will be like, this is exactly the patch level and version it is. But often you have to look at other indicators. And sometimes you have to look for specific nuances in the way that a server will respond to a request to truly understand what version it is. And that takes some time. Because whereas it'd be great if you could just say, hey, what version are you, and come back and be like, I'm this version. A lot of products don't do that, so you have to detect that in other ways.
Yeah, I think this is an area where we can be working collaboratively with suppliers too to really help make it obvious when a patch has been applied, when a mitigation has been applied, that it has been, so that you don't mess up the vulnerability scanners. So as a society, we could probably work together a little bit more effectively on that.
Thank you. We do have another question. What steps can I take to secure a management interface that has to be on the public internet?
Definitely ACL rules. So if you have a management interface that has to be exposed on the internet, I'm guessing most of the internet doesn't need to be able to reach it. And so I would put an access control list that would limit the location of who on the internet can actually access it.
Thank you, Sherry and Tom. Once again, this is Sarah with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you again and have a great day.